During a photo shoot, parents posed with their sons and dog for a family picture. The photographer then zoomed in and got the shock of her life. Emma scanned the scene in front of her while adjusting her camera strap over her shoulder. A few feet away, the parents posed with their sons in a perfect line, their golden dog sitting submissively at their feet. "All right, a couple more shots," Emma shouted in a happy tone. "Lean a bit closer, Mom and Dad. Hold still for a second, boys." Perfect. She quickly took pictures of the family in the warmth of the setting sun. The lads smiled mischievously while their parents laughed and attempted to discipline them. Emma checked some of the pictures. She always enjoyed getting a brief preview during live sessions. However, this time, she gasped when she went back through the pictures. Hesitantly, she moved her finger across the screen, her eyes fixed on the images. "Is everything all right?" the mother finally asked, noticing something was off, her voice tinged with worry. Emma forced a grin as she suddenly looked up. "Yes, indeed. I was just making sure the lighting was correct. Just a second." She was no longer paying attention to the illumination, though. She adjusted the camera while her stomach rumbled. Her fingers trembled a little as she narrowed her eyes at the little digital screen. She brought the camera up to her eye and took another picture, this time concentrating on the spot that had captured her attention. The image flashed on the screen as soon as the lens snapped. Her thoughts were racing. Might the lens have a smudge on it? A camera error? Her hands automatically reached for her cleaning cloth, but the detail was still there. She lifted the camera and took another picture. "No way," she said in a barely discernible whisper. She zoomed in closer, her palms becoming clammy. The oddity became more pronounced and obvious. It was illogical. One of the parents called, "Miss Emma," bringing her back to the present. "Sorry, can we do a few more?" she asked. She reorganized the family while concealing her mounting discomfort. Her actions were robotic this time, her thoughts fixed on the image ingrained in her head. She took another picture while attempting to gather her thoughts, but her hands began to shake once more. The parents looked at each other, observing her abrupt shift in attitude. The father stepped near a little and asked, "Is everything okay?" Emma's lips tensed as she faked another grin, but her chest constricted as she took a final look at the picture on her camera. The image took her back 3 years ago. Emma had been pregnant. Like any mother, she had dreamed of the day she would embrace her firstborn. When the time finally arrived and she got to hold her baby, she had never felt such excitement. She could clearly recall every detail, even the delicate cry that seemed to contain a world of promise, the weight of her infant in her arms, his small fingers curling around hers. However, that happiness was abruptly taken away. The nurses had taken her son to the nursery for a normal checkup, and Emma had fallen into a light sleep. The nightmare started when she woke up. The hospital was in disarray. Doctors and nurses stood in panicked huddles, avoiding looking at her, murmuring among themselves. When the police showed up, she knew something was seriously wrong. A nurse finally approached her and confessed, her voice shaking, "Your baby, he's nowhere to be found." Emma was shocked and devastated by the words. Her child had been taken. Despite a thorough search, a review of the security footage, and incessant interrogations, her newborn boy was nowhere to be found. Years had passed since then, but the pain never went away. Even though her own heart was broken, Emma threw herself into her work as a photographer, documenting the milestones and happiness of other families. However, she always felt a twinge of longing whenever she saw a child, imagining what her son would have been like at that age. She had no idea what had happened to her son. Little did she know that the thief had been a desperate woman who couldn't conceive. But when she took Emma's son, the baby couldn't stop crying. The woman was alarmed. Hours later, overcome by fear and shame, she left the baby at the entrance of an orphanage. When the baby was discovered, as there was no knowledge of his origins, he was given a new identity and a new life with a family. Emma never knew this. All she knew was that her baby got lost in the hospital. The police had suspected he was stolen, but the case was never resolved. One thing Emma couldn't forget about her baby was the birthmark she had seen on her son's little arm. That mark was engraved into her consciousness. She looked for this mark when she visited orphanages, in the hopes of a miraculous reunion. However, after 3 years, hope had begun to fade. Her prospects of finding him were growing slimmer and slimmer. However, a mother's instincts kept her from giving up completely. She carefully examined each family she took pictures of and each child she encountered, searching for a birthmark she didn't think she would ever see again, until today. Emma repositioned her camera and took quick photos of the family. The tension in her chest became excruciating, but she tried to remain professional. However, Emma's thoughts were racing. Could it be, or was she just trying desperately to make a link where none existed? She decided she couldn't leave the moment without answers. With her camera dangling around her neck, Emma walked up to the couple. Her voice faltering with a tight but kind smile, she said, "Excuse me, this might sound a bit weird, but how old is your youngest?" Mrs. Smith, the mother, cocked her head in interest. She smiled warmly and replied, "He's just 3. Emma felt her heart race faster. This couldn't be a coincidence. She continued cautiously, trying to hide her increasing despair. "Oh, how charming. He's really handsome." The mother smiled. "Thank you. He's perfect. The best choice we've ever made." "What do you mean by the best choice you've ever made?" Emma asked. "We adopted him when he was a year old. He was so adorable, we couldn't leave him," Mrs. Smith replied. Emma clenched her hands together to stabilize herself when her hands started to shake. "That's fantastic," she murmured, her voice trembling a little. "Which orphanage, if I may ask?" Mrs. Smith gave a courteous response, though somewhat taken aback. "Just a few hours outside of the city, Street Ann's Children's Home. They treated us extremely well." Emma was familiar with the orphanage, having visited it on several occasions while searching desperately for her son. But at the time, there had been no hints that would have led her to him. Emma continued hesitantly, "I hope I'm not overstepping, but your younger son. The birthmark on his hand, I think." Emma inhaled deeply and trembled. She was no longer able to contain herself. Her voice was shaking as she confessed, I lost my son 3 years ago, shortly after his birth. He was stolen from the hospital. All I can recall is the birthmark, which is identical to the one on your son's hand." The Smiths halted, their faces changing from bewilderment to surprise. "Are you saying?" Mr. Smith started, but as Emma's words took hold, his voice faltered. Emma nodded, her eyes full of tears. "I believed he could be my son." The days that followed were filled with feelings and research. Emma spent restless nights mentally reliving the photo shoot while she awaited the results of the DNA tests. What if she was mistaken? Could it be that she was merely holding on to a cruel coincidence? But she was about to get the shock of her life. The DNA results soon came back, and what they revealed silenced all her doubts. It was her son. Despite their initial shock, the Smiths were incredibly compassionate and understanding. With sadness in her voice, Mrs. Smith stated, "We had no idea. We have cherished him as though he were our own. But if you were his mother..." Emma wiped away her tears and shook her head. She remarked, "You've shown him so much love and care. You have my eternal gratitude for that. I don't wish to separate you from him. I simply want to be involved in his life." In a touching reunion that the Smiths had organized, Emma finally held her son again. He looked up at her with interest, and she traced the birthmark on his small hand, overcome with emotion. Gently, Mrs. Smith said, "You're his mother, and he belongs with you. But if you don't mind, we'd love to be a part of his life as well." Emma smiled through her tears and looked at the Smiths. "I'd be honored. He's lucky to have you both." What began as a routine photo shoot ended with a miracle. Emma's search was over, but her journey with her son and the Smiths was just beginning.